All right. So, yesterday we had started Sif Yud, which is really contains the meat of this whole halacha of Darche Shalom and this new concept of Ani Hamahapech Bechorara. So, Ani Hamahapech Bechorara is um, taking advantage of someone else's efforts and undercutting them and basically grabbing something from them that they had prospected before. And there's a lot of difference of opinion, and there's a lot of different shades of gray here. But the primary theme is that if you know that someone has been uh, um, eyeballing a certain enterprise and has put in effort, and you go ahead and you swoop in and you take away that person's opportunity that they've been working on. That's the case of ani hamahapech bechorara. There are times when it's permitted, and there are times when it's usher, depending on the circumstances, and those circumstances are what we need to sort of try to get down to. So what we had saw before is that if first the Rav Shulchan Aruch had created a distinction between whether the person is a regular person or whether they are an ani. So there's an opinion that states that difference makes all the difference in the world. That if a person is eyeing something that is hefker, and and you come in and you swoop in and you take it from them, that's okay unless that person is an ani. Because if the person is an ani, you have to have added compassion to that person because he needs the item more, and you always have the opportunity to go somewhere else to find whatever your needs are. So that was the first thing. And if the person is an ani and he's about to take something from hefker, and you swoop in and take it before he has a chance, so that person who does that is called a rasha, is called a bad person. The Yesh Omrim, and just to review, Shalo Amru Kain Elakish Shemahapech Lihistaker Eitzel Balabayis Chorara Be'ad Eza Sherut Sheyisharatehu. Some say that the only true evil is when a person is working on an enterprise with another individual, and he's trying to provide a service and make money off of that transaction. Uba acher v'kadmo nikra rasha mipnei shu yachol lihishtadel lihistaker kein b'makom acher. That's when the person who tries to undercut him is called a rasha, because here's this poor guy, he's trying to make a little bit of a parnasa, is in the middle of contractual negotiations to provide a service, and someone comes in and undercuts him and takes away his opportunity. That's where you're called a rasha. Af sheyiyalo ezatorach b'hishtadlus ad sheyimtza makom acher kazeh, ma she'en kein b'mitzia. So this second opinion is that you're not called a rasha if you take a one of a kind item and you spot it. The other guy spotted it first, but you come in and take it. You're not called a rasha in that situation, because the only time you're called a rasha is if you could easily, without too much effort, go and find another opportunity somewhere else. But if it's a one of a kind item where there is no other opportunity for you to find that item somewhere else because it's just one item on the street, so then you're not called a rasha, even though the other guys eyed it first. You're not called a rasha in that situation. V'chein ikar, and that's how most poskim go. Umikol makom bal nefesh yachmir la'atzmo. But nonetheless, a a person who is concerned with proper behavior should be machmir as well. That even when it comes to hefker, one of a kind items, if you know that someone has already prospected that item and has eyed it and is about to take it, you should not swoop in and take it from them. Now we get to where we left off yesterday, and we're going to go through the Imrei Yaakov in all of this. Aval hamachazer acher davar liknoso, bein karka bein metaltalin. But if a person has already prospected over an item that he wishes to purchase, whether it's real estate or chattel, uba acher v'kidmo, and someone else comes and undercuts him, nikra rasha. There, everyone agrees that you're called a rasha if you try to do that. Shaharei hayam motzei liknot olim kor b'makom acher al yedei torach v'hishtadlut. Because since that item is always available to find somewhere else, in other words, there's plenty of real estate, there's plenty of chattel, and this guy happened to find someone who's willing to sell him an item. He's begun his negotiations, and they're in the middle of the process of settling the deal, and someone else, who's another Jew, comes in and undercuts him. He says that second person is called a rasha, because let him go find another deal somewhere else. And even though that other deal will require him to exert effort, but that extra effort does not justify grabbing a deal away from the first person. Ela im kain hu koneh bezol gadol she'eno matzui liknot kach b'makom acher. He says the one exception would be is if it's such a phenomenal bargain that bargain is not available anywhere else. In that situation, azai dino kimetzia, so then it would be comparable to something that you find from Hefker, which is a one-of-a-kind item. When it's one-of-a-kind, so technically you're not in violation. If you see a guy running towards it and you are faster and you can get it, so then technically the law will allow you to go take it for yourself, right? Is an ani, right? But but that's provided that the first person did not do any kind of mechanism of kinyan. But once the first person has done a kinyan, and sometimes a kinyan is considered to be a handshake in certain kinds of situations. Sometimes a kinyan could be that they signed a letter of intent. But whatever the kinyan was, if after the kinyan was made, a person would come in and try to undercut and try to undo the first deal, so then everyone would agree that that second person is called a rasha, and perhaps even in this situation, where the kinyan has been made, he might even be a gazlan, and it might even be an actionable offense. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I want us to go through very, very carefully what all of these halachas are. So the first thing, let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov on Lamed Tes. B'makom shelo zachu. In a place where a person's Daled Amos does not acquire the item for them, then even if they throw a garment on the item that's hefker, technically they haven't acquired it, and therefore someone else can go ahead and take it. Kegon bistei chavero o birshus harabim sharabim dochakim sham kidleil siv zayin. So he says, and like we spoke out yesterday, either it's in, like Barry had said, it's in your friend's field, or it's in a very tight, densely packed Rishus Harabim, where a person's Daled Amos do not acquire the item for them. Avol b'makom sha'arba amos konos kana. He says, but in a situation where a person is, let's say, on a side street, and he's within the vicinity of that item of Daled Amos, so then he's kona. I can't go ahead and take it from him at that point. V'lo amrinan dehol v'nafal aleha goli daite delonicha le delikne Daled Amosov ki im hanafila. And no one can suggest, although this is suggested by the Gemara, but we don't hold that like that. Maybe the fact that a guy throws himself on it or wants to throw his garment on it, he's demonstrating that his Daled Amos are not being kona for him. So therefore maybe you could argue that I have a right to take it first because he hasn't been kona it yet. So that we do not say. And there are situations where his Dalet Amos will be Kona, but we're talking specifically now where his Dalet Amos will not be Kona. And so the halacha states that mutar la'acher, that as long as he hasn't, the first person one has not been Kona the item, person two can swoop in and take it if it's a hefker item. Perush dekan mairi shaharishun hu ashir, uvazeh lekadin mahapich b'charara. Meaning that the person number one is not an ani. He's a regular person who's of means. And therefore, by the second person taking it away, he's not in violation of ani hamahapich b'charara. Ulam ze omer behefker umitzia. Aval b'mekach nechleku haposkim k'delekamen divrei maskul yachmir al atzma. But he says, but this is only with a one-of-a-kind hefker item. But when it comes to a purchase of real estate or chattel, so then we have a machlokes haposkim as to whether, when the person is not an ani, whether there's a violation of ani hamahapich b'chorara when you swoop in and you seize the deal, even though the person number one was already prospecting on it. And sha'ani hamahapich b'chorara v'chulei, dafka b'mahapech v'lo zacha bo adayin. The word mahapech means to be prospecting, which means the ani is, the word charara is a garbage heap. The ani is sifting through the items. That's literally the image that the Gemara presents, but he hasn't been kona specific items yet because he hasn't gotten to that part of the garbage heap where you see something that might be of value. He says that's the situation that we're dealing with, which is that he's in the vicinity of the item. He's sort of staking a claim on this garbage heap, and for you to go ahead and for the second person to come in and start inching in on his turf is called ani hamahapich b'charara, because he can rightfully say to you, why are you prospecting on my garbage heap? Go down the block, go 2 blocks over, there's another garbage heap. There's plenty of garbage heaps in this town. Why do you have to take the one that I'm working on? That's the principle that we have here. Aval im zacha kevar mishanotel mimenu habigazlan. But in a situation where an actual kinyan was made, where the ani actually picked up the item, and then he puts it down beside him, so then not only are you in violation of ani hamahapich b'charara, but you're actually a gazlan. You're stealing. Because once a person makes a kinyan on an object, you don't have a right to take it from him just because it left his hands temporarily. So, when are you called a rasha? So the first is that when you take it from him from hefker, and he's an ani, where you swoop in and you grab it from him first, and he's an ani. So there the Chazal call you a rasha. Hainu mitakonas chachamim. This is a rabbinic ordinance. Umachrizin olav bebeis hakneses sha'asa ma'isa resha. And we make a public announcement. We are permitted to make a public announcement that this person committed an act of evil, even inside the shul. V'chein, we don't do this anymore, as I'm sure you would imagine, because, first of all, we don't get that many complaints like this, but even if we were to get a complaint that a person did something treacherous to another person, we would try to solve this quietly, because the communal structure is very different from what it was when these halachas were written. There are even some poskim who go so far as to suggest that if a person has committed an act of ani hamahapich b'charara, that he becomes no longer kosher to be a witness for, let's say, weddings and contracts and things like that. Aval ein ha-beis-din mechayven oso lahachziro. But the only thing that the beis-din cannot do is obligate him to return the item to person number one. What you did was wrong. What you did earns you the moniker of Russia. But because this is only a rabbinic institution that was done lichatchila, that you should not swoop in when someone is prospecting on, when an ani is prospecting on something, we cannot force you to give it back to him. V'chol ze dafka b'mezid. Aval im haya shogeg de lo yada shereuvin mahapich achar zeh, as ein alav shum din klal v'yesh chalkin. But this is only when the second person is aware that the first person is prospecting, and nonetheless decides out of his greed to go ahead and take it away from person number one. But let's say the person number two wasn't even aware that person number one was prospecting. Remember, that's the story that we saw yesterday in the Gemara with Rav Gidl and Rabbi Abba, right? Rav Gidl was prospecting on a property, he was negotiating with the owner, and all of a sudden Rabbi Abba swooped in and purchased it. So Rav Gidl was very upset, but the fact is that Rabbi Abba had no knowledge that Rav Gidl was already in negotiations for the purchase, and therefore you can't call Rabbi Abba a Rasha. And not only that, but Rabbi Abba went above the letter of the law and wanted to give him the property. So there's a machlokas as to whether, if a person was an accidental ani hamahapech b'chorara, where he wasn't aware that the first person was prospecting, do you call him a Rasha or not? And there's a machlokas as how you deal with that person. Some say that from that story that we learned yesterday in the Gemara, you see that Rabbi Abba, even though he wasn't aware that Rav Gidl was prospecting, still felt a moral obligation to give him back the item, and therefore you see from that every person should do that. And others learned that Rabbi Abba was going above the letter of the law, was going above his requirements. Okay. Now, the person is called a Rasha. Va'af she'ein motziino so b'dayanim kidla'el mikol makom roi lo letaken ha'avla ula'achzir. Once a person has been proven to be this second person who was took away the item from the ani, even though the Beis Din cannot force him to return it, but the proper thing to do is to rectify his evil and to give the item to the first person. In other words, yes, the Beis Din will tell the person, we can't force you to give it back to him, but if you want to do the right thing to do would be to give it back to him. And then, by rectifying that, you won't be called a Rasha anymore, and no one will have any recriminations against you, any grievances against you, and so forth. Let us continue. We're going to do some of the biurim, but first let's finish the Imrei Yaakov on this sif. Ma she'ein kein b'mitzia. Then we saw another opinion, and the other opinion was that the only time that there's a problem of ani hamahapich b'chorara is when we're dealing with transactions. So person one is the process of negotiating a deal with some balabayit who wants to pay him money for a service, and person number two comes in and swoops in and undercuts him. That's when there's a prohibition of ani hamahapich b'chorara, but there's no prohibition of ani hamahapich b'chorara when you're dealing with a unique item that's hefker, because the whole reason why a person's called a Rasha is, why'd you have to come in on my turf? Just go somewhere else. But if it's a unique item, maybe there's no prohibition of ani hamahapich b'chorara. So he says, u'ledei yazu lo rak shelo nikra rasha, ela afilu lechatchila mutra litala. According to this second opinion, when we're dealing with an item from hefker, a mitzia, so then it's even, not only are you not called a Rasha when you swoop in, but even lechatchila you're allowed to go and take the item, because it's a free enterprise system. Ulam im harishon torach pa, az aser kidla el sifhei va'ayin biurin. But that's only if the first person had not exerted significant effort to procure the hefker item. But if he did already exert significant effort, so then you're not allowed to take it, even though it's still hefker. The example that we gave was back in Sif Hey. So I want to just remind you of what we saw in Sif Hey, so that you'll realize, I don't have it here, but basically, because it was from the previous packet, But basically, the idea that we saw in Sifhei was that if a person went up to climbed up a tree and started beating the olives or the dates, and they all fell down to the ground. Remember that case? So those olives or dates that fell to the ground are hefker, right? They're still hefker because the guy hasn't made a kinyan on them. But if someone were to come along and to take those olives or dates, he would be called a rasha because the other person has already invested significant effort to procure them, and without his efforts, no one else would have access to them. So even though they fall to the ground, and the ground, let's say, is a hefker area, and you could argue, hey, look, manna from heaven, right? These dates or these olives fell from the sky, and the guy says, hey, what are you doing? You hear from a guy yelling up on the top of the tree. He says, what are you doing? He says, well, I found these dates. They seem to be hefker. I'm just going to go take them home with me. He says, no way. I just climbed up this tree. I've been spending the last few hours whacking this tree, causing the dates to fall off. I worked hard for those dates. What are you doing? He says, well, they're hefker. They're hefker. So everyone would agree that in that situation, it's usher for the second guy to take the dates, even though they're still hefker. The question only would be, is there legal action that can be taken against the guy who takes them? So, but everyone would agree that if he takes them, he's called a rasha. So, in the final analysis, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that technically the law is on the side of the person who wants to opine that there's no prohibition of ani hamahapech b'charara in a situation of mitzia, in a situation where you're picking something up from hefker, and the only time that there's a prohibition for the second guy to swoop in is only in a case of transactions, when person number one is trying to purchase something, and person number two comes in and undercuts him. And he says, V'chein ikar, so that's what we saw in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, U'mikol makom bal nefesh yachmir la'atzma. But nonetheless, a person who's concerned about ethical behavior should be stringent upon himself and abide by the first opinion that says that even with hefker items, there's a prohibition of ani hamahapech b'charara. So he says, Hinei be'inyan zeh, dahainu ibe mitzia v'hefker shaykh ani hamahapech b'charara. So he says, so this issue that the Rav Shulchan Aruch is raising, is there a possibility of a prohibition of ani hamahapech b'charara with hefker items? He says, Nechleku Rashi v'Rabbeinu Tam. This is a machlokes Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. The two commentaries, Rashi is on one side of the Gemara, and Rabbeinu Tam is in Tosfos, on the other side of the Gemara. The Rashi Svirale, the Gam Bahem Shayach Din Ani HaMahach B'Charara, and that Rashi is of the opinion that when something is from Hefker, there's also a prohibition of Ani HaMahapich B'Charara. V'chelek Meha Poskim Azlu B'Shitasa. And there's a significant portion of the poskim who side with Rashi. Ula me'idach harbe hiskimo l'shitas Rabbeinu Tam. But there's another significant group of poskim who side with Rabbeinu Tam, d'sfirale de behefker u'mitzia lekadin ani hamahapech b'charara, who holds that there is no prohibition of ani hamahapech b'charara when something is hefker. The Harama, Siman Reish Lamed Zayin, Kosav Dechein Iker Ladina, and the Rama, who is usually the final arbiter, says that we paskin like Rabbeinu Tam, and that's why the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that if you wish to hold like the Rama and swoop into to a hefker item, you are permitted to do it, provided, like we said a moment ago, that the first person had not exerted significant effort in order to acquire the hefker item. And then when we get to Yachmir La'atzmo, he should be stringent. Ulam af l'dei yazu d'spirle da'afilu b'mitzia v'hefker nikra rasha modim de'imzeh haba liskos techilahu asher de'bazelo mikri rasha mishakidmo. He says, according to the opinion that the laws of ani hamahapech b'charara apply to even hefker, So that's only when the person prospecting the hefker is an ani. Okay? Im lo bedavar she'eno matzoi da azafilu ba'asher mikri rasha. Unless, and here's where it gets tricky, unless the hefker item is such a rare find. It's not like, a guy prospecting through a garbage heap and he finds a shmata, he finds a piece of fabric. Let's say there's a very rare coin from a century ago and a guy sees it on the street and he's looking at it, he hasn't picked it up yet, and it's clear that it's hefker. And before he has a chance to pick it up, another guy comes in and says, "Hey, that's mine," and he picks it up. He says it could be that even when the first person is a person of means, that could also be usher, according to this opinion, because when it comes to very rare finds, rare items, then everyone is considered an ani vis-a-vis that rare find. Lachain. And therefore, karka, obayis, gamba asher shahafach liknos hanot lo nikor rasha. And therefore, when it comes to purchases that are opportunities, and which are difficult to find, and certainly when it comes to transactional opportunities, which is not acquiring something from hefker, but is actually, let's say, a guy discovers that there's a house for sale or a piece of property for sale, and he's already started the negotiations with the seller. So if a second guy swoops in and starts and undercuts him, so that second person is called a rasha, mishum shehem eno mitzuim kolkach gam la'asher, because it's a rare opportunity, and because it's a rare opportunity, the first person can claim to the second person, what you're doing is unethical, because it's going to be difficult for me to find a similar deal somewhere else. V'yesh desvirale de la rabbeinu tam de kaimelon kavase ein hevdel ben ani la asher v'gam ba'asher ika din ma'apich b'charara the asur la'acher litlo v'lo rak bekarka ubayis elahu hadin b'sha'ar devarim. And according to there are those who say that according to Rabbeinu Tam, where the laws of ani hamahapich b'charara only apply to transactions, there's no differentiation made between an ani and an asher. So there's a lot of ambiguity here, and it might even be worthwhile to make like a little chart to demarcate all of the different opinions. But let's be very clear. Everyone agrees that when it comes to transactions, if person number one has already begun the negotiations, begun the process of negotiating with the seller to purchase an item, to purchase a property, or to purchase chattel, and someone comes in and undercuts him, so then the second person is in violation of ani hamahapich b'charara, even if the first person is not an ani. Okay, the gray areas become, what about hefker? What about hefker items? If an item is hefker and the first person is not an ani, does the second person can he be called a rasha by swooping in and taking it before the first person has a chance to take it? And there's different shades of gray. Sometimes the second person will be called a rasha, for sure, if the first person is an ani. But if the first person is not an ani, then it depends on how rare the item may be considered. Okay. Again, there's a lot more detail here. We're going to have to hold off for the next sifkat until tomorrow, just to get some clarity. We haven't even seen any real cases yet, and I want to go through some real life examples where we'll talk about, let's say there's a house that goes up for sale in Thornhill, and and there's multiple people who are vying for the same property. At what point does a person become an oni amahapich bechorara? So that's something that we have to talk about. Some real life examples of this. Okay, so this is where we'll hold it for today, and we'll Mirz Hashem continue tomorrow. All right, have a great day, everybody.